Okay, we are officially recording.
Excellent.
So, yeah, again, thank you so much for being here. And we always chat a little bit about this, on and off, but it's good to kind of like get down and have like a deep kind of actual thought out conversation, um, about, what is really plaguing men, um, as far as, you know, mental health, and what our culture kind of thinks about it, the stigma that's all around it. Um, it's it's really hard, um, especially as a man. It's really hard to like come to terms with what you're dealing with, right?
Yes.
Um, because you have so many emotions going through your mind that you, for one, you weren't. Nobody taught you how to like deal with these emotions, right? Nobody taught you how to uh, understand them. So then, one, you have to come to terms with them, and then try to comprehend them, and then try to manage them, and try to like figure out how to still be a fully fledged male that
Right.
society, what society pictures as a fully fledged male. So yeah, I mean, with that being said, thank you so much, Christian, for being here. If you don't mind, like, let's just kind of talk about it a little bit. Like, what have you experienced as far as the stigma goes?
I think the first stigma is when I go to individuals to share with them, oh, I live with a mental illness. The disbelief, which in some ways I try to find flattering. They're like, "What? I would have never known." No, you're kidding. Are you sure? Have you gotten second opinions about that? I'm like, I'm pretty sure. I know what my health is like. But in that is just because there's this stigma of what mental illness looks like, and that you can't be a functioning, responsible adult with a mental illness. And I think, that shock, even though I don't think they mean anything derogatory by it, it is. And then the other things is just the flat out refusal and acceptance that men and minority men can have a mental illness that's crippling in some way. The famous expressions of pull yourself up by your bootstrap is something that you constantly hear. Or man up is the phrase that I absolutely despise.
I hate that
Because,
phrase.
because it literally just discredits any other emotion,
Yeah.
any other reaction other than one. And if anything that we've been taught in the 21st century is that it's okay to view things differently, that there's a spectrum to how people handle things. And that includes men.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the whole being macho thing, I mean, I'm gonna say from my own personal experience, being from West Africa,
Yeah.
you're not giving any sort of leeway at all as far as dealing with anything, or even as a kid, like you're we are like bred as younger males to like squash everything, right? Like as a kid, if you're crying, like, it's, at least in my experience, it's like, why are you crying? Like,
Yeah.
that's your sister's job. Like, you're not supposed to do
Exactly.
that.
Yeah.
Like, you're supposed to be quiet and like deal with it and move on. And even that, like, seeing like the lessons from my father, um, and to say, lack of lessons from my father on how to deal with things as a child, right? Like, dad was always quiet, very stoic, very like,
Mhm.
you know, beyond reproach. You're not supposed to question anything. And dad never showed any emotions. Like, I didn't even know if my dad had friends growing up, like, or anywhere. Like, all I saw was dad go to work, come home, and then he ate. No one was supposed to bother him. And then that was it. Like, that was the
Yeah.
end of it. So, like, growing up and moving to the US, which was still a fantastic opportunity, that my family got, it was even worse here, to be honest,
Yeah.
because this society has had, I feel like, the examples of the men that went to war, and
Mhm.
when war came calling, they left their families, and like, that's what you do. You go, you take charge of things, and you deal with things, and then you come back and
Yeah.
you don't talk about it. we see that example now with vets too, especially when they come back, their society's just like, no, you're not supposed to have mental
Yeah.
problems. Like, just recently, I think we've been seeing like PTSD become more of a recognized issue, right?
Yeah.
Amongst vets. And
I
if you see
remember
a, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I remember hearing about people coming and talking to family members, who were in World War II and in Vietnam. And, if someone didn't come back, being able to just completely disassociate from their experiences during wartime, it was like, oh, they were weak. Oh, they
Yeah.
weren't right in the head. And, and it's because it was like, no, these people went through trauma and they're human, but we dismissed that for so many generations. It's just that individual just being, well, they were weak, or they were weak-minded individuals who couldn't handle, being a man, or who couldn't handle wartime.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like especially dealing with things like it's it's crazy when you come back, and especially with vets, when we're talking about vets, like coming back and seeing that everything that has changed, right? Like
Hmm.
them internalizing that and then trying to process it and then trying to figure out how to move forward. But going back to like men in general, and men, like also, men of color and minority men, um, they're really at a disadvantage when it comes to what kind of resources that are available. Um, I know in the past we've talked about like going to therapy, right?
For
Um,
sure.
and having that resource available. And I don't know if men of color really are able to do that. Uh,
I remember first, I remember accepting the fact that I needed to go to therapy in order to maintain wellness. So that was a hurdle, but then trying to find a therapist, not only that could speak to my vernacular, but that I could really connect with. I could understand the cultural experiences that I was dealing with. I had a really phenomenal doctor, um, who was a white male, and he was on hands down the best doctor I've ever had. But when it came to therapy, the best therapist I had was a Southern Black woman
yeah.
who could understand what I was talking about. She could understand what I was talking about when I spoke about my father and my grandfather. She could understand what I was talking about when I talked about, societal norms, when I
Mhm.
talked about, because the reality of it is, despite what people may want to think or may make them feel comfortable, is we deal with discrimination. People deal with discrimination if they're a woman. People deal with discrimination if they're gay or lesbian, or they fall under the LGBTQ community. People deal with discrimination based on race. So that is a stressor. And so even in talking about that, if you're talking about that with a therapist who can understand your culture, your background, and even your experiences, the therapy makes more of a connect.
Yeah.
The treatment is more real, and as a patient, I bought into that treatment more so than as a therapist that I had who was of a different culture, different race, a different ethnicity, and she's giving me advice, and I'm just kind of like, what world do you think I live in where
Yeah.
that is applicable to me?
Yeah. No, I mean that's totally understandable. I mean, for me personally, I think I've told you this, is trying to schedule an appointment, which was the easy part, but actually going to the appointment for me was something that, like, especially as somebody that prides himself in really trying to figure out his emotions and trying to deal with the things that he's gone through in the past. And like, especially when we talk about mental health, it's a journey, right? It's a
For
process,
sure.
and you're never fully done with it. So for somebody that prides himself in really being out there and being an advocate or trying to be an advocate for this, I still couldn't come over that hurdle of scheduling a meeting and going and being open to a random stranger, a total stranger in a very formal setting.
Yes.
Um, I remember thinking about it, of what I would love to have in that moment, right? Talking to a therapist. And I thought about, man, it would be really nice to have like a glass of scotch
Yes.
as I'm discussing these issues that I'm having, right? Like I would love to have some alcohol
Yeah.
to go through this, which brings us back to like how as young boys, um, we're taught to not deal with our emotions. And then as we grow and become adults, and become men, and we go into society, and we're trying to start a career, and we're trying to like have a family, or we're trying to, have everything, career, friends, relationship, manage all of it together. The easiest way for us to deal with our emotions, since we're not allowed to talk about it, is to, one, drink
Yeah. And
heavily,
that's
which
socially
is what I
and
did.
that's acceptable. Yeah.
Right,
And that's
right.
acceptable.
So it's the easiest excuse to use. Is like, oh yeah, of course I'm going to happy hour. Of course I'm gonna have a couple drinks, and by the time you know it, you're 10 drinks in,
Yep.
thinking about what you could have said to your boss during the day or something like.
Or just flat out avoiding everything, and just saying, I'm just going to forget. I'm not dealing with it.
Yeah, yeah, no. I mean, personally, I've gone through this where, it's really like damaged me physically, but also like it's damaged some relationships I've had.
For sure.
Trying to deal with, especially trauma that I had never experienced before. So like my last relationship ending was trauma I had never experienced before, because that relationship lasted for so long,
Hmm.
right? And that's something I had never experienced. I'm like, oh, this is lasting for 5 years. This is gonna go on for forever. And when it ends, it just ends abruptly, and you try to pick up the pieces. Um, and it's interesting that we also lie to each other, because that's what I did, right? We lied to each other, and I lied to myself, and I said I was fine because I had a new job, and I was traveling, I was seeing all these places. I was like, oh yeah, I'm fine, I'm dealing with it, this is
Yeah.
my way to relax. And then a year or two later, I find myself in a hospital because I've been drinking way too much.
Yeah.
um, which is just not really a good thing. And it's not just me. A lot of other people that I know, a lot of other men that I know in my life, have done the exact same thing.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about, we have similar experiences in using alcohol as self-medication, as a coping. And I know for me, it was an escape, and it was acceptable. And in my community that I was around at the time, over drinking to deal with your problem was an acceptable reaction.
Right.
But what wasn't a normal or acceptable reaction was saying, hey, you're not okay. I think you should go see a doctor.
Mhm.
Hey, your behavior is a little off. Hey, you seem a little manic, or you don't seem like you're doing well or handling responsibility well. And so that wasn't a normal conversation. Actually, it wasn't a conversation at all. It took a total outsider to come in before I got diagnosed and really started getting healthy. That changed all of that. But before that, yeah, it was totally acceptable and normal to go out and get blackout drunk. And that's how you dealt with your problem.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say, the thing that wasn't normal was to say I have a problem, was
Mhm.
to say I'm dealing with something, um, that something, like another male in your family could understand, could comprehend. Um, Leaders, even like leaders in your community, could understand, but they're not going to be able to. They just won't ever recognize it, and allow you the time to actually like figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
Um, and and I don't know if this is only my perspective or my understanding, but correct me if I'm wrong. Women in Black communities and minority communities, and women in general, I feel are able to form bonds even as adults,
Mhm.
deeper bonds that men just can't reach.
Yeah. I think, obviously, there's this strength in America that, Black women are supposed to have all the time. Um, and that can be a lot of pressure on some people. But I grew up in a family with really strong Black women
Mm-hmm.
who beat unbelievable odds. But there was always a price to pay for them, number one. And number two, they did have a safe sense of community.
Mm-hmm.
Women are able to speak more freely about problems in their marriage or problems with their children or situations if worked at the time with that. And then they also, for my family, had a very strong, tight-knit religious community.
Mm-hmm.
And so women had all these outlets to do these things. You brought up something earlier about your dad that kind of made me chuckle. It made me think of my dad. My dad worked. That was his identity. Like, he worked, he came home and he ate dinner, he talked to my mom, he checked on his kids, and that was kind of like it. Dad worked. That was it. That's
Yeah.
really what I remember. So, but, mom, she had girlfriends, she had friends that they'd hang out and they'd do all these things. Grandma, was super tight in her religious community and had all these outlets, but it didn't seem that way. I wasn't shown, the example
Mm-hmm.
wasn't set that men needed outlets as well that don't include alcohol.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, yeah. The example isn't there. And I was listening to um, a Dr. Neo Way, and she was speaking about boys, right? Like boys, um, why relationships between boys change from pre pre-adolescence to post-adolescence. Because if you take a look at boys that are 10 or 11, you have a best friend. If you think back at it
Mm-hmm.
in your own childhood, you have a best friend, and you do everything together. But then somehow in the next 2 or 3 years, right, you go through a moment, 2, 3, or 4 years, you go through a period where just things change. The relationship, the dynamic changes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I remember going through that as well, where you just don't rely on your friends as you used to. Um, but in girls, it doesn't change, right? Like, it actually grows and intensifies, and like it just gets stronger. But somehow boys just, like, I don't know what happens. I don't know what in society. I don't know if it's going through puberty or if it's that once we go through that, we come to a point where we're just like, well, yeah, that's that thing of talking about your feelings is just for kids. Like, that's not for me. I'm
Yeah.
gonna be a grown man now. Like, it's time to, again, like you said before, men up and and not deal with those silly things anymore. Um, which is just really interesting. The research behind that, and it's interesting also to see that I haven't seen a lot of men, a lot of academics, male academics, leading the charge as far as researching what those problems are or what solutions could be when it comes to dealing with mental health and trying to at least get rid of that stigma or get society to like help boys out a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think so. I remember we talked, this was probably one of our first conversations, as I started looking for outlets and support for, living with a mental illness and how to manage that. I remember reading some blogs and some articles or watching YouTube videos, and there was this person who's out in Colorado or California who gets diagnosed and goes through hospitalization, things that I was experiencing at the time. And their spouse hires a nanny to help with the kids, and then they go off to some cabin in the middle of Wyoming for 3 months to journal and to relax. And I'm just thinking, who on God's green earth is this speaking to? What audience is this? I could not find an audience where it was like, how are you a man, you have a family, you have responsibilities, you're in leadership roles within your employment, and you have to manage, you have a chemical imbalance.
Yeah.
I mean, that was, I couldn't find that at the
Yeah.
time anywhere. Now, since then, in the last few years, a lot more things have popped up, a lot more resources have popped up for men, especially. But I just kind of remember, like, where's all the resources at for men? Where's
Right.
all the resources at for little boys? And especially for me, it's a very strong emotional connection to where's the resources for little boys, for men of color,
Yeah.
for the black and brown boys.
Yeah.
And in this journey that I found through advocacy and educating myself, I find that it goes so much deeper than just that surface level stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is generations. A lot of this is a result of, I believe that generational PTSD exists.
Hmm.
I know that's still a debate within, some academic and scientific circles. But when you lay out timelines for America, you lay out the experiences of what the African American, the brown, the Mexican American, what these communities have had to deal with for decades and for
Hmm.
generations, it has an impact on the environment that you were brought up in, has an impact on how you handle and deal with trauma in your life, and therefore how you raise your next generation and your children. And so I
Right.
really feel like where this all began for Black and brown men in the United States in particular is this is a direct result of what the experiences of the African American family were.
Yeah.
And I
No,
think
I mean,
that's a tough conversation for some people to really have and accept. And I don't believe that you can really start a healing process until you recognize that.
no, I mean, I think you're completely right. Like, I've, I, I, I get that some of these traumas like exist, and that's one thing. To be honest, that's one thing that I've had to like really also like research and understand, especially being in the U.S. because I'm from West Africa, so like
Hmm.
my ancestors really didn't pass down this trauma, right? So one, coming to the US, I had to really understand, trying to understand African Americans in the US and figure out why is this so that they're, you know, everybody is has this sense of fear, the sense of not belonging, the sense of again, like you said, this trauma that persists when it comes to dealing with like community policing and all that stuff. That's a
Hmm.
whole different discussion.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, but especially when I started my mental health journey, when it comes to dealing with mental health, that's one aspect of it that I never thought about is this thing is passed down from through generations, from male to male to male to male,
Hmm.
and your father teaches you what he's learned and what he learned, and
And that's
you
if you had
you
the privilege of having a
a
male
father
in the
that's
picture.
exactly, which is a whole also a whole other discussion, right? Like having one, like the boys that are born and grow up and have this male father figure, right, in the family, they lack that leadership anyways when it comes to like dealing with your emotions and dealing with mental health. But again, in the African American community, if you don't have a male figure in the community, right, how are you supposed to deal with that? Like, yes, like
Hmm.
you may have other men like your uncles or people in your neighborhood that step in and like help out, but they're not helping out on with how to deal with your emotions,
Yeah.
um, which then leads to just leads to just horrible things in the future. It leads to you growing up as an adult and not knowing exactly how to make the right decisions, or how to, um, you know, having a family and not knowing how to manage your emotions or
Mm-hmm.
stress,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're coming from a community, or if you're coming from a background where you don't have a lot of financial resources and you have to like work a couple jobs to maintain that. As a man, you have to just be strong and just
Yeah, it's a survival kicks in, I think, for with people. I mean, I have become such a more understanding person in this journey than I think I
yeah,
ever was before, because you really understand different outlooks. And there's a survival thing that kicks in when it's like, I have to put food on the table, I have to pay the bills. I don't have time to sit here and talk to you about how you feel or how I feel or how my action is making you feel, because I'm working 2 or 3 jobs. I'm hustling to pay the bills, to get our kids to school, to whatever that looks like in their particular life. And so there is this survival instinct that kicks in, and they do not
yeah,
have, it's like, I'm not talking about feelings right now. Who's got time for that?
yeah,
Um, but it's a disservice. It's the same thing. It's a joke that, men will, have chest pain, and
yeah,
they'll just have a glass of water and keep going with their day.
right.
Well, we know how dangerous that can be, and what the end result of that can be. And so, the same way with their physical health and ignoring those symptoms, people do it with their mental health, and they ignore symptoms until things are just not okay, or they just never become okay.
Yeah, no, then that we're talking about this, I think to like my barber that I normally go to, but I haven't been to in a while. um, and he is so busy. Just and I'm trying to figure out, okay, how would he deal with his emotions? And I found out that like I think it's by just he tells everyone what's happening in his life, right? Like everybody,
Hmm.
like if you go in the barbershop, you're welcomed in. Like this is my family. This is like I gotta go do this. I gotta do that. And like I feel like that's kind of his way of saying, okay, like I need to tell somebody I'm at least doing this,
Yeah,
or I'm just gonna be so overwhelmed that I'm gonna have a breakdown, or I'm just gonna one day just snap.
yeah,
um, and it's interesting that these problems aren't just in the Black community, right? Like
no,
we've talked about it, they're in the Hispanic community, um, but also like trying to think about other cultures that deal with a more intense version of the stigma of not talking about your emotions, of always working, always being responsible, especially when it comes to men. I think about like Asia, I think about
hmm,
Japan, I think about South Korea, I think about China, and especially South Korea. One of these, this country, the work rules when it comes to men. I went there. I had a chance to go there in October, and a lot of the people that I met, a lot of the guys talked about this thing, which I'm sure is not just in South Korea. So once a day or once a week, the boss takes everybody out, right? The entire office, and you have to stay there and you have to drink, and eat and have fun until like and it's rude to leave before the boss. Like it's rude to leave. So like if your boss is a big drinker and won't stop until 3 in the morning, you're staying there until pretty much. And I have a couple friends that work in South Korea that have told me like, yeah, man, like once a week we have to go and you can't leave. And the next day you also have to show up at work.
on
Um,
time.
on time. You have to be at work. You have to show up, and you also can't be the first person to leave work. So like so many of these things, especially like when I think of that country and that culture, one as a man, right? Typically, and it's changing now, but typically you're the breadwinner.
Hmm.
Um, and again, I'm sure it's changing now. But you're the breadwinner. You have to go to work, so you're dealing with having a family, having a kid, having kids, a kid, having your job, and the pressures that come from that. Not showing up late, but not leaving early. and then also the culture of drinking that's there. I mean, the week that I spent in South Korea, my liver was just like done. And that was just casual drinking with friends. So
Yeah.
I don't like, I can't even fathom to think about what men in South Korea, Japan, China do to help them to deal with what they're going through.
I give a talk to different groups about how to balance, your mental health with your professional life.
Mhm.
And in one of these talks, I was talking to a young group of interns, and there was a young gentleman of Asian descent who came up to me afterwards, and he was like, I know that I have depression. Like, I know I have a major depression. And he starts listing off some of the symptoms that he's been experiencing. And he's like, how do I communicate with my parents to believe me?
Mhm.
And it was just something like, he was like, no, like, seriously, like, how do I communicate to my parents to believe me and that I'm not just being lazy?
Wow.
And that was really hard for me. I'm a parent, and so I love my children. I communicate with them. I want them to always talk to me. I want to help them. And I just couldn't imagine like being that kid and just trying to express yourself to your parents. Like, I'm in bed for days or whatever the symptoms he's dealing with, not because I'm lazy, but because I'm sick. And that was just not a conversation in his house. And I gave him my personal opinion advice, not being a licensed therapist or counselor. Really encouraged him to seek that route of treatment to really get the tools necessary, not only for himself but to communicate with people around him. But that was the first time I thought about other people, other
Mhm.
cultures, other ethnicities,
Yeah.
and the stigmas around mental health, that it doesn't just exist with men. It doesn't just exist with Black or brown individuals. It obviously doesn't just exist in America, but that in
Yeah.
every culture, there's this stigma around mental health, period,
Right.
man or woman. And then it increases if it's mental health in a man.
Exactly. Like
It's a
one thing,
universal unacceptance.
it's that's shocking, that he says I can't go to my parents, which that's not the shocking part. The shocking part is that they would think that he wasn't depressed, but he was
Mhm.
just lazy.
And the symptoms that he shared with me were like depression, like clinical depression 101. I mean,
Mhm.
it was like you just opened up, you know,
Yeah.
WebMD. I mean, it was spot on. And I was, and for me, it's like that. And even though I know my own experiences, it doesn't matter how many red flags there are. If your
Right.
culture and community around you is not open or trained to understand that, they're never
Yeah.
going to see it. But for me, in that moment, I was just kind of like, how is no one seeing that this kid, this guy, pardon me,
Yeah.
is suffering? Because that's what's happening. I mean, it's not, it can feel like a physical pain, but when you have a mental illness or your mental health is in really poor, because I do believe mental health and mental illness are two separate things.
They are.
But
They are. Yeah.
but when you're going through that, it's painful.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that people don't understand, is that these people are in pain,
Yeah.
which is how you have people like, our beloved Robin Williams,
Mhm.
who commit suicide. I mean, that's a
Who on
really
the
tough
outside,
conversation.
yeah, like
Yeah,
people on the outside are
this man
so
had everything
happy.
together.
They seem to have it together, right? Which goes back to what you said earlier
Kate Spade.
when it came to you, was people couldn't understand that, wait, you're going through this as well, like you're
Yeah,
not well. Um and that's the whole point. It shouldn't be shocking, right?
yeah,
When a close male friend decides to open up, it shouldn't be shocking. And again, going back to treating society to understand these issues, to understand that this thing really does exist, and it shouldn't just be talked about by celebrities and then dropped after a while,
Mhm.
right? Because
Mhm.
that's usually what happens. You know, a
Yeah.
celebrity will come out and talk about it and say, "Oh yeah, I go through this," but then after a while, it just drops. Like nobody ever picks it up, nobody mentions it anymore, and the people that really are losing out from these resources or these, you know, experiences that other men have had and not seeing them are the everyday men
Yeah.
out there in our communities, in the world, in the US, in Asia, in Europe, in South America, like not seeing the example of, hey, this is okay, this is how it's supposed to be done. um, our women kind of show us the way of dealing with your mental health,
Mhm.
right? um, you can look to women, to be honest, at how they build relationships and how they build bond, and how they like even looking at my partner, how she's dealt with, like I sit and look at her sometimes and I'm like, how are you dealing with things that you're experiencing right now? Like, because I know, you know, I'll know what she's going through or what she has to deal with at work or in her, you know, with her family or anything, and then I'll be like, if it was me in that position, I would
Mhm.
crumble.
Mhm.
I would turn to alcohol, or I would turn to working out,
Mhm.
right? Um, but mainly I would probably turn to alcohol, which is, it's sad to admit, but it's the truth.
Yeah.
And I asked her, like, how do you deal with it? She's like, oh, I've created my relationships. I have my friendships. I know who to go to for this. I know who to talk to for this. And that's something I don't have. That's something
Yeah.
men seriously lack.
And we
Um,
could learn from women to self-care too.
yeah,
Like, take care of yourself, you know? It's not just a female thing to be like, nope, I'm having a girls' night and I'm doing this, or I'm going to the spa, or I'm going to
yeah,
give a bubble bath and drink some champagne.
yeah,
We don't have to do that, but we have to self-care. And I think
yeah,
that's a big thing we can learn from women as well.
yeah. I mean, self care. That's really important. So you're a father, and to phrase this question is what have you seen, and what have you, in your experiences so far, what have you seen and that are things that are going to help you, um, help your kids and your son,
Mhm.
um, when he gets to a certain stage where he's dealing with things, and when he's going through things like this.
Um, you know, my father died when I was very young. He's been dead now for almost 20 years. Um, but I learned something really good from my father. My father was a hard worker and a really true provider.
Mhm,
And my father truly loved my mother. So those are the positive things that I really did learn from him. What I didn't learn though is really how to process emotion as a male,
mhm,
and how to be um, vulnerable with your son. And with the therapy, with the self work that I've done, and managing my own mental health, my own mental illness, it has allowed me to be so much more open and recognizing when my son is vulnerable.
yeah,
So my son just, he's just crossed over out of the preteen years, and he's preparing to go into high school soon. And it just, I can recognize things, I can catch it, and I can be that soft support that he needs when he needs
mhm,
just love and he just needs support. But I can also be dad and kind of put the hammer down when he's
mhm,
being, just a boy that I need to rein in a little bit.
yeah,
But that's one thing that I've noticed that I'm happy about in my relationship with him. But also just setting up that for my children, it's very important. I have a very open relationship with them now, especially. But it's just communicating with them. They are so aware, oh, dad's not feeling well.
mhm,
or even when we speak, because they now live with their mother. They used to live with me, now they live with their mom. Even when we speak, one of their questions is, Dad, how are you doing? How are you feeling?
Mhm.
And I'm very honest with them. Oh, I just had to increase the medication. I was feeling really down, or whatever that looks like. It's an open, honest conversation with them. And so I'm hoping that I'm stopping the bad habits of previous generations.
Yeah.
That it's going to be healthy, open conversations that are real conversations. And my daughter is 10. She's 11. She's 10. She's 10, and it happens. It happens.
It's okay.
But
It's okay.
but she, even with her, and being able to talk about feelings, and to be able to come to Dad and talk about feelings for them, and just having this open, healthy conversation. And even for them, they've gone to therapy, and luckily their mother and I have agreed that, at certain points in their life, it's good to talk to a therapist and a medical professional. And so we're already setting good mental health habits in them.
Yeah.
And so no longer, there were times in my childhood that my mother recognizes now, we all should have gone to therapy when that happened.
Yeah.
Or I should have put you kids in therapy when this happened. But no one told her. No one in her community told her that. Her mother, her grandmother were alive, her aunts. This just was not this was not part of the dialogue in our community. It wasn't part of the dialogue in our family. Therapy was never mentioned.
Yeah.
Medication for people who have chemical imbalances was never mentioned. And so now there has been a total change in tide. Now, many members of my family are really caring for their mental health, which is really encouraging. We all deal with it in our different way, but in particular for my family, there's an open conversation, and
Mhm.
this is as realistic as if someone had diabetes and they got to check their blood sugar.
Yeah. Yeah. No. That's amazing to hear. It's really important, and that's the whole goal here, right? Is to not stop everything that's happened so far in past generations, but to slowly start like turning the wheel of change, right? To
Hmm.
slowly start like if it's one or two people that you get to think about, like you get them and you ask them to think about exactly what they've gone through as far as mental health, and if they can start implementing things that they're going to be able to pass on to future generations, that's how we change the system. That's how we change the current norm.
Hmm.
And I'm really excited that like you're able to like implement these things with your family and with your son, and recognizing what you've gone through, what your family has gone through in the past, right? Like that makes me think about my own family, like what we've gone through, the traumas, right? From my parents divorcing to everything that we went through as kids. Um, the other day I was just thinking about like, so my older brother, I was thinking like there was a few years ago he just like there was a change in him, um, that I had never been able to understand until a couple weeks ago when it finally clicked in my head and I said, "Whoa, he has never in his life had an opportunity to stop and think about himself." And ever since he was a teenager to a young man to now a full grown adult dad of two kids, married man, like he has never had time to himself. And the traumas that I saw him go through, um, and I can't do justice for what he's gone through, but I can only speak about the parts that I've seen. Is it would have been great to have a leader in our father to show
Hmm.
us the way. It would have been great instead of dealing with the trauma. It would have been great to, dealing with trauma and not having a roadmap or not having the example. It would have been great to have had the example. It would have been great to have seen it, even in another male figure in our lives. Um, and that's one thing I kind of want to talk to him about as well. But it's going to be tough. It's going to be really tough because again, in society we have this, this problem of never talking about emotions, and in my
Yeah.
family especially, it's so tough to get anyone to open up. The only true like moment of connection that I've ever had with my dad was when we went to a football game, like at one time, like years ago. And the only moment was when he tapped me on my shoulder and pointed to the cheerleaders. And then we both shared a laugh. And then that was it. Like there was no other conversation for the rest of the football game. And that's like, that moment was good, but like that's not the moment that I want, right? That's
Yeah.
not the moment that we all want from our fathers,
Yeah.
from the men, the leaders that are in our lives. Um, and I really hope that there's a way. I really hope that soon we start seeing the change, and we start seeing the wheel turning in the opposite direction of having men really just confront their issues. Because I still face that. We're still our own worst enemy. I still
Yeah.
face moments where when I don't want to deal with anything. You know, I don't like. I know I'm not feeling well, but I just push it down, and I just keep keep going through whatever I'm going through. I go through it silently, and I see it with starting this whole thing on Instagram, of trying to like show men, um, examples out there of people, that are working through these problems, trying to tell them like, hey, these things are normal. You're going through it. Somebody else is going through the same issue. Here's an example. And like, you can talk about it. You can go to your friends and your partner and your brother and talk about it. Um, when I approach people in DC and try to start a conversation about, they'll ask you, what do you do? Right.
Hmm.
That's like one of the
That's
main
the
questions. What do you
Washingtonian
do?
question. Yeah.
That's the question. And they go, they'll ask me, what do I do? And I'll tell them, well, one, I'll tell you about my job, but also these are some of the projects I'm working on. And I'll mention, I'm really working on this thing where I really want to focus on mental health for men. And just trying to like show people that it's okay to share your emotions and um, share your emotions, which is one way to like start treating your mental health and making sure it's better. And I get shut down right away. I mean, it's not even like,
Yeah.
even as soon as I mention mental health for men, they go, oh yeah, that's not for me. um and I really want to start seeing leaders out there, for the everyday regular man.
Yeah.
And I
Because
really
it,
hope.
it it goes to show you that there's still that strong stigma, you
Yeah.
know? Man.
Yeah. So when I was doing the whole thing where I would have conversations and I would share their stories on Instagram, um, I even went to my best friend, somebody I would call like my brother. He's I mean, we've gone through a lot, and I went to him and I said, hey, I really would love for you to be part of this. Um, and we talked about it. We're both from West Africa, right? And we talked about it. We had a really frank conversation. Um, but plot twist, we had a really frank conversation about me and what and why I'm trying to figure out what's going on in my life.
Yeah.
Right? He was like, "Well, what's wrong with you? Like, just do
What's wrong
do
with you?
your job and
Yeah.
just move on. Like, it's fine. Don't worry about that. Just plow through." And it really wasn't how I wanted the conversation to go,
Yep.
which was a shocker, man. It was a real shocker for me. But I'm really glad we got to do this and kind of just talked about the stigma and talked about some of our experiences and how we could go in society is at least change things, start changing things. I really appreciate you coming on,
Absolutely.
and we'll definitely have more of these talks for sure.
No, I think, yeah, no, I think this is important. I think it's important for our community to see people talk about this, people that
Yeah.
look like them talk about this. I mean, we know how powerful it is to see, you know, African American Black doctors. We know how powerful it is
Mm,
to see Black police officers. We know how powerful it was to see a Black president of the United States.
yeah.
So, we know how powerful it is to see people in leadership set the example for us. And I think
Mm,
that having Black men talk about mental health and mental illness is on how important that is. And I think that's powerful. And I think that
yeah.
it will help people say, okay, you know, I can do this, or at least know that they can reach out to someone
Yeah.
and have that conversation.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the things we didn't talk about that's always important is like, you know, sometimes talking's not enough.
Mm,
And sometimes you need medication.
yeah.
And that's a whole nother conversation for men to accept the fact that, especially if there's a chemical imbalance. So if there's a chemical imbalance, there's an illness, and that they have to get medication to really manage that
Mhm,
illness. That's a whole nother conversation for men, and especially minority men, to accept,
mhm,
and then to make a commitment to be healthy. So
yeah.
yeah, I think that this is very important what you're doing.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate it. That was a really good point that you mentioned, like seeing examples and um, seeing, people that look like you lead the way. And hopefully we see more and more academics that deal with mental health, especially we see more men um, come out and post research or publish research about it. Hopefully, we see more Black men and Black women as therapists, as people in charge of this community or leading this community. So, yeah, no, I really appreciate this conversation. We'll have many more to come, especially on relationship building,
Yes.
which is a whole other aspect of staying strong, and especially as a man. So thank you so much, Christian. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Comey. I look forward to talking to you soon, buddy.
All right. Bye bye.
Okay.